Thank you very much, Carl, and I'm delighted as part of the family of the endowment to be here with all of you today, and I thank you very much for organizing this conference to do so much to uphold the legacy of Vaclav Havel. And I'm delighted to participate in today's session alongside one of my dearest friends, Michael Jantovsky, who did write the definitive biography of Havel and played such a key role in Havel's transformation from intellectual troublemaker to intellectually troublemaking statesman. Along with a lot of people in this audience, I benefited immensely from Havel's intellect and troublemaking, and while his accomplishments as statesman made him a hero to me, what I valued, I have to say, most of all, was a most unexpected and precious friendship. We held countless meetings, formal ones, both in Prague and in Washington, but I remember Havel most vividly in casual settings when he felt free to talk about whatever was on his mind, from music to theater to the frustrations of politics and the mysteries of the universe. I could tell many, many stories, but I think that the kinds of things that I loved was when we did wander around Prague and went to jazz clubs and told stories to each other. He got very irritated at me because he kept saying, we're the same age, and you have so much energy. What's the matter with me? And I said, I didn't have to go to jail. But I think that the stories, I think, so indicate his widespread interests, and some of the, I could tell many of them, but one I have to tell when I just ended my sentence, Mysteries of the Universe. So shortly after he'd been to the United States, he went to Bermuda and asked me to come and visit him, and we went down there, and we went to the NASA tracking station, and I was always the interpreter, and we talked about different things. He finally said, could you ask them if they've seen aliens? And I thought, I don't think I'll translate that exactly that particular way. I also have to say that one of the more fun things I did was when I took Robert Redford to Prague, and we wandered around Prague with Havel and went to all the theaters and discussed the cultural life. It was one of the most fantastic things that just seeing him and all of us being together. I recently, there's so many really fitting ways to pay tribute to this great man. And I recently received, for example, one of those, a small bell that Wendy Loors brought to the embassy, actually. Ambassador Gandelovich was there. The bell was sent to Bill and Wendy by Charter 77 Foundation as part of an effort to raise awareness for his birthday, and then to raise some money for a larger plan to really do some things in the church where the foundation is. And I was asked to sign a book that went along with the bell and then to take a selfie and get others to do the same thing. So what happened was that the bell actually coincided with the official visit of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi to Washington. And I was scheduled to see her. We spent some time together. And naturally, I decided to bring the bell with me, which was kind of a weird trying to get through security with it. I'm not sure what exactly Daw Suu thought was happening, but once I said the name Havel, she was more than happy to sign the book and to pose for a selfie. And I think it made it very special. Bells aside, it was fitting for me to have the opportunity to talk to her about Vaclav Havel because it was because of him that I actually made such a strong connection with my good friend Sue. And this was in '92 when she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and Havel actually was the person that nominated her. And I was at that stage approached by her late husband, Michael Aris, who asked if I could arrange for Havel to write the introduction to the volume of her books. And so although the request didn't have much to do with his day job, as president of Czechoslovakia, Havel was very pleased to do it, and because of how much he had admired her and because of the sense of obligation he felt towards men and women on every continent who still struggle for recognition of their most basic rights. And this obligation, in my mind, is central to our discussion today about Havel's legacy and the future of democracy. Because even though he was very much a product of his country's culture and history, what distinguished Havel was that he thought, spoke, and acted on behalf of principles that will always matter everywhere. And to further illustrate what I mean, let me just share another story that I think many of you know, but it really does make sense to repeat it here. Not long after he became president, President Havel traveled to Washington, where he was scheduled to deliver an address to the joint session of Congress, and I had the honor of helping him to prepare. And because he had little experience in public speaking and had developed a habit of avoiding eye contact, which he clearly still had, we brought in an expert to coach him on his delivery. And even though we had translated the speech into English, Havel, as he was reading it, said, "This is not my word, I would never use this word," and he insisted on delivering it in Czech. And Michael Jantovsky was his voice in the Congress when it was delivered. Havel's delivery itself was not so great, but it didn't matter one bit. He may not have been the smoothest of orators, but he was authentic and also surprising. The world had expected him to denounce the Soviet leaders who had long oppressed his country, and instead he requested help for the Russian people in making his own transition to democracy. Instead of treating the Cold War's end as a climactic victory, he emphasized the challenge that lay ahead, to create a world shaped by moral responsibility. Instead of focusing on ideology or politics, he stressed the obligations we each have to one another. Narrow interests of all kinds, insisted Havel, must give way to universal principles and concerns. And it was a very idealistic speech, not the sort that most national leaders would give, but we know that Havel's conception of leadership differed from that of most presidents and prime ministers. He had no interest in the kind of political rhetoric that divides people into one camp or another, or that exploits anger, resentment, and fear. He worried that the defeat of communism would prompt democratic peoples to conclude that their work was done, and that in the future they could always expect to enjoy the upper hand in battling evil. But complacency was not in Havel's dictionary. He celebrated his country at its best, but without falling into a trap of chauvinism. He argued to domestic and foreign audiences alike that despite all the external foes we might face, our most dangerous enemy is our propensity towards selfishness and indifference to others. The logical corollary to this argument was his relentless advocacy on behalf of civil and political rights for all people. Whether the specific challenge that was posed by apartheid, as in South Africa, or an ethnic cleansing, as in the Balkans, or genocide, as in Rwanda and Sudan, or political repression in Cuba or China, Havel never hesitated to raise his voice on behalf of justice. This was true in the days of Charter 77 and the Velvet Revolution, and it was true when he served as president, and it was true in the final weeks and months of his life. I remember vividly the conversations I had with him during that last year. He was encouraged by Arab democracy movements and by the promising developments in Burma. In October 2011, he signed the Budapest Appeal, which reminded every country in Europe of its obligations to observe democratic norms. His last public statements were in support of prisoners of conscience in Belarus and of opposition protests in Moscow, where on the day of his funeral, 80,000 demonstrators observed a moment of silence to mark his passing. It's natural to wonder what Havel would have made of the events that have transpired in the 5 years since his passing. I know I often do. Clearly, he would have been frustrated by the world's inability to stop the slaughter in Syria, and he would have been deeply troubled by the response of his own country and many of its neighbors in Europe to the refugee crisis. I believe he would have been concerned about the rise of populism globally, while worrying about how European unity has been undermined by forces both external and internal. And when I remember what it was like to go to Prague and welcome the Czech Republic into NATO and how pleased he was, I know he would have been perplexed by Donald Trump. So he would have felt frustrations, to be sure, but I'm equally certain that Vaclav Havel would not have allowed these frustrations to harden into despair, and neither can we. And yet, as we gather here to discuss the future of democracy, there's no question that it is undergoing new and rigorous round of tests. The combination of new technology and social media has empowered citizens everywhere to voice their views with a breadth, immediacy, and volume never before possible. And this matters because of the widely held perception that democratically elected leaders are failing to create jobs, reduce debt, and end conflict. For their part, presidents and prime ministers often find that their responsibility exceeds their power and that they're unable to satisfy their constituents' hunger for instant solutions. Along the way, democracy's enemies have become increasingly bold and outspoken, and they're turning to sophisticated new tools to undermine confidence in our institutions, including hacking, disinformation campaigns, and online trolling. We are in the middle of an information war, and democracy's friends are both unarmed and ill-prepared. And that's in part because in the 25 years since the end of the Cold War, we grew too complacent and too confident that the democratic tide would rise simply because history was on our side. We underestimated the tenacity of our opponents, and we did not pay enough attention to the admonitions of Vaclav Havel, who urged us in that speech to Congress to treat the Cold War end not as a conclusion of a bitter struggle, but as the beginning of a new and even greater challenge. If Vaclav Havel were here today, I'm sure he would say that it is not too late for us to regain the upper hand, because throughout his life, he bore witness to rationalizations we often employ to avoid meeting our responsibilities, whether civic or moral. Like Nelson Mandela and Aung San Suu Kyi, he forgave his jailers and was charitable toward those who fell short in the test of courage. But he also assured us over and over again that we could do better. Whether he was reminding his own countrymen of their best traditions or rousing the slumbering conscience of the world, he never wavered in his commitment to personal liberty, respect for human rights, and the defense of liberal democracy. The best way for us to honor his legacy would be to renew our own commitment to these principles and to demand even more of ourselves in defending them around the world. A few months before his death, many of us gathered in Prague to celebrate Havel's 75th birthday. My gift to him was a compass that had been used by American soldiers in World War I, the conflict that led to Czechoslovakia's founding. In my note, I cited the irony of giving a compass to someone who has served as the North Star for a generation. But 5 years after his death, Havel's star still shines bright, and his legacy still lights the way for all of freedom's friends. And that's why it's so appropriate that as we reflect on his life today, we are also set to discuss how to carry on the work that Havel so nobly advanced. And let me just end on a personal note. As a Czechoslovak American who spent the Cold War in the United States, and people kept saying, "What is your country doing?" The Hungarians had a revolt in 1956. And the Poles revolt every 10 years. What's the matter with your people? And then Havel came along, and it made me so proud to be of Czechoslovak birth. And of moments that I will never forget was going to Prague and standing in the Castle Square next to President Clinton and President Havel as we sang the Star-Spangled Banner, Land of the Free and the Home of the Brave, and then followed by the Czech national anthem, Where is My Home? Thank you all very much.